I'm joined today by Martha Schlicher, who is an executive in residence at Biogenerator, CEO of two portfolio companies at Biogenerator in the agricultural space. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about sustainability, which sustainability is something that many companies are talking about. It's obviously extremely important if we're going to deal with climate change in any meaningful way. And agriculture, it turns out, which presumably it's green. It literally is a green, you go out to a field, it's green, yet responsible for a large amount of the carbon emissions, yet can also be part of the solution. Martha, talk to me about well, first of all, welcome, and talk to me a little bit about the agriculture challenge and paradox and opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So I think most people are now familiar with all the fluctuations that we're seeing in weather, that the climate is changing and it's warming. And certainly companies are taking a lot more responsibility for what they can personally do to try to minimize their emissions. And emissions, greenhouse gases, that are what are warming the climate are things like carbon dioxide, things like methane, things like nitrous oxide. So it's coming out of your tailpipe, right? It's coming out when you burn coal to generate electricity. It's coming out when you run your furnace. So all of us have a footprint, a carbon footprint, and all of us should be doing everything we can to minimize it. Agriculture, I think, is really unique in this story in that agriculture, the producing, say corn or soybeans, is going to generate greenhouse gas emissions because of the nitrogen utilized to fertilize those crops as a major contributor. But the way a seed becomes a plant and something we ultimately eat is by not just pulling in nutrients from the soil, but also carbon dioxide from the air. So it's actually sucking greenhouse gases out of the air and storing them as food that we all ultimately then can eat. So agriculture has a really unique role to play here in that not only can it work by increasing yield, right? If it can increase crop yields, it requires less land, by being more judicious with how it puts out fertilizer, but also by using practices that store that carbon in the plant and store that carbon in the soil. So we've learned over time that we can actually increase the amount of carbon that's getting sustained in the soil. We can all think about really dark, rich-looking soil versus gray, pretty sad-looking soil. That rich, dark soil has a lot of carbon sequestered in it. That's a way of storing those greenhouse gases for a really long period of time. And so growers adopting those practices are actually being tapped by other industries for those credits, for other industries to be able to offset their carbon footprint. So growers are achieving these practices because they also help them enhance the production of their crop. And other industries are benefiting from the offsets they can achieve by what growers are doing.
So what will be the major elements to make agriculture more sustainable?
Yeah, so number one is yield by far. The more I can produce per acre, the fewer acres that I need. And boy, in the past couple of decades, because of the dramatic increases in yield, it has prevented us from having to essentially double the amount of land that would have been required for food production.
So food production yield has doubled in the last decade?
Couple of decades. That productivity has been huge. And if you think about it, otherwise I got to go get a new acre. And in some cases, those new acres come by clearing a forest. A forest is storing carbon, right? That's not a good thing. I don't want to destroy those forests. So now yield is by far number one. But number two would be something that's called no-till. That means when you grow a crop, at the end of that crop year, after you've harvested the soybeans or the corn, you let the rest of that plant stay in the soil. You don't clean the soil, make it a nice, beautiful, clear field. You let that plant residue, that carbon residue, stay in the field and sequester that carbon in the field. That's one really big practice. The second biggest practice is something called cover crops. Cover crops are something that you would plant over winter, alternating from the crop you're growing for food in the summer months. And that again allows you to have another crop sequestering more carbon in the soil, deep roots going down in the soil to sequester carbon. There's actually a local company here in town called Covercress, also a biogenerator portfolio company, that has a cover crop that actually produces an oil. So you can actually produce, say, biodiesel out of the oil from that cover crop, which also is better than gasoline for greenhouse gas emissions, as well as storing carbon in the soil. So a lot of innovation going on.
So if agriculture moved down this track of implementing these elements that will increase sustainability more quickly, how much impact would that have? You know, from what you're saying is 25%, agriculture now accounts for globally 25% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. How low could we get it? How quickly?
Yeah, agriculture and forestry. So the thing I'm excited about is a lot of the agricultural companies, more companies than ag companies, but are setting goals for carbon neutral. And you first start on that with the production you're doing yourself, so you can make really rigorous measurements. And then the next step is, of course, to see how you might be able to transfer that to all of the growers, you know, here and in other countries. There's still a lot of innovation that's needed, a lot that can be done. What if you can get to carbon negative, right? That's even better. And that's things like really trying to optimize the amount of nitrogen fertilizer you might apply to maximize yield, but to minimize emissions, right? Livestock are also a pretty significant source of emissions. And so looking at ways that you can manage manure, you know, differently, ways that you can change, you know, in Europe, it's pretty common to use that manure to actually generate natural gas to fuel other things in fermenters. So the commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement or the UN goals has really cascaded down to corporate level goals, investors really holding companies accountable for those goals, and now consumers doing the same thing that are really driving all of us in industry towards what innovations are possible, and those innovations are going to be rewarded because investors are paying for them to be able to continue to reduce our footprint.
But in other words, we could significantly reduce the footprint fairly quickly if we began implementing these changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can probably all look at it in our personal lives with a little bit of guilt of the things we know we could be changing just to reduce our footprint. So there's some things that are obvious today. There's other things that are emerging. And then there's, of course, going to be big innovations that are at a more basic level of research. You know, I think a good example at GreenLight would be the development of products that are going to control insects in the field using a biological instead of a chemical insecticide. A chemical insecticide is petroleum-based. That's a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. Biological-based pesticide is not. So that's another great way to reduce the footprint of agricultural. Biological products versus chemical-based products. They tend to also be more environmentally safe and not target things that you don't want to kill, like bees and butterflies, and only going after the things that damage crops. So the best sustainability solutions are the ones that provide many benefits, right? Not just the green benefit.
Right. Okay. So the irony is that in addressing these challenges, we're also answering other elements. It's not just about, the sustainability, but also the biodiversity at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. And I think it's fascinating to see how on the agriculture side, it's a challenge, but an addressable challenge that then can be applied to help other industries that don't have the green outlets or the green potential of agriculture itself.
Exactly. Part of the solution. Thanks, Thomas.